Hello everyone and welcome back to Chris Aquatics. Now in today's video I'm going to be giving you guys my personal opinion on snails and keeping them in your aquariums and my personal experiences that I've had with them in the past and present, so that I can share a bit of knowledge with you guys and you guys can decide for yourselves from here if you want to put snails in your aquarium or not. So let's get into the video. Firstly, I want to point out the type of snails that I have in my tanks at the moment. So I have a mixture of regular ram swan snails. I also have the kind of like reddish ones. There's leopards as well, and there's also pond snails like this right here. So I have them in almost every single tank that I have. The only tanks that I'm fairly sure don't have snails are this one here and this one here and maybe this one here. I've tried my best not to keep them in these tanks, as I'll get into the video later. I'll point out why. One thing most people don't know is that snails have a high bioload. They create a lot of waste, and in a tank like this it can be a big problem, especially when they die. So you look in here, you take a look at the bottom. I've purposely left this for a reason, to show you guys. Look at all those snail shells, and you follow the base and they're all over the place. And this is just at the front of the tank. Now I've purposely not cleaned this so that I could show you guys in this video, as I've planned this video out for that reason. But it does come to show that the snails create a lot of waste, and they do remove waste, don't get me wrong, but I'd say that something like a shrimp is a lot better than a snail for that reason. Now this tank is another reason that I don't like snails. You look in here and they're just all through it, in all the crevices. The ram swans have just bred out of control. And my peppermints, you can see one right there, every single time I try to feed them some algae wafers, the snails cover it in a matter of minutes and the plecos can't even get to it. So I really am trying to get as many snails out of here as possible. It has been a lot worse, so I've been doing fairly well. But even on the side here, you can see just they're all in the gaps, and they're in the base, and they're all over the place. So in my opinion, they're doing more damage than good for me. Now you take a look at this tank and you don't see many snails around, but you do look at the front, and if it will focus you can see these ones. So there's a pond snail, and then there's ram swan snails, and then there's snail shells. There's 4 snail shells right there. And I'm at the point now where snails are becoming more of a hassle than they are being helpful. So I am starting to just phase them out of my tanks as best as possible, as I'm not enjoying them anymore. Now some people have the argument that snails are good in shrimp tanks and that they do well in those kind of environments. So you can see there's ram swans in here. See if we can focus on a couple. So you can see they're all over the substrate and they've all gone through. So this tank is also infested. This is a lot better than it was. This tank is where I want it to be. So there's not as many snails in this one. But it goes to show that when you get a couple snails, they can turn into hundreds pretty quickly. Now, my personal opinion, I don't think adding snails to a shrimp tank is a good idea anymore. There's probably better ideas that you can go with. I have some baby albino bristlenose in this tank, for example, and I'm trying to just phase snails out, like I said. They just get into everything. You can see them all over. They get really small too. So I think it's just probably best to avoid snails for that reason. They already create a high enough bioload to have problems, and when you add it to a shrimp tank where you're trying to keep stable parameters, it's probably best not to have them. So I'm starting to remove all of them from my tanks. When I set this tank up, I tried my best to remove as many snails as I could, and I did a fairly good job. They've obviously come back. They're always going to come back. You can see some pond snails in here. I've been removing them on the daily, snail shells too, but I've been removing these on the daily because I don't want them in my tanks anymore. There's some circumstances where it can be good, which I'll get into, but for every single tank I've shown you guys so far, I would avoid them. Now one of my newest tanks with my pygmy corridors, we can maybe see one, there you go, there's one right there. I've ended up deciding that I'm going to add cull shrimp in here, so there's a cull shrimp over there, you can see. I've decided that snails in this tank isn't gonna end well, especially when cories, I want them to breed. Snails eat eggs, they'll eat the eggs of most fish, fairly sure all fish to be honest, so I figured that adding them to this would not be beneficial. Now in my Carradina tank, I have decided that snails are not a good idea because keeping the Caridina parameters at a steady level in a small tank is already hard enough as it is. I don't need snails breeding into the hundreds, especially when, I'll show you guys how much room I have to access the tank, which is not a lot, so it's probably best to avoid it. I have done a fairly good job. There's like none in here from what I could tell, and whenever I see one I pull it out straight away. So with Caridina shrimp, I don't think snails are ever going to be a good idea. They just fluctuate the water parameters and these guys don't like it. Now this tank, I have a video coming out soon, hopefully, when I start to get these guys to breed more of how I'm going with these. But these are red neon blue eyes, or they're luminatus, Pseudomogul luminatus. I'm trying to get these to breed, and if I have snails in this tank, the snails are going to eat the eggs before I get to them. So I've decided for a cleanup crew instead to have just regular cull reds. So I've got red culls in this tank at the moment. And I think if you're trying to have like a cleanup crew for a tank like this where you're trying to breed, I'd just go with shrimp. Snails just aren't worth it at the moment. I don't think they'll ever be. I think maybe neorites could be worth it, but here in Australia, those things are just so expensive for no reason. So I've just gone with shrimp. Now this setup here is probably like the only example I have of a setup that I would keep snails in. So I started by adding a handful of ram swans into this tank, and they're in here at the moment. You can see they've been in here for quite a few months and I haven't had issues with them. I also have two small Medaka fry in here that are somehow alive, which is cool. I'm just testing it out to see how they would go with it. But in this kind of setup where it's enclosed and there's no filter, I think snails are a great idea. I have some ghost shrimp in here also, but the snails do a very good job at keeping the setup clean, especially with no filter. So you can sort of see one of the ghost shrimp right there. But you can see with all the plants in here that they don't really have much deficiency when it comes to anything major. So I think that the snails are also fertilizing the plants in a good way too, as I've never really done a water change on this. I kind of just let it be in its own place. So I think for a setup like this, snails are great. Now I want to make it clear, I'm not saying directly that snails are terrible for your aquarium. I'm just saying from my point of view and from all the reasons I listed, it hasn't benefited me in most circumstances. So you can take it however you want from this video and let me know of your feedback and how you guys have had this sort of thing happen with you and what kind of things you could suggest to other people in the comments down below, as snails tend to end up in most of our tanks from just plants that we receive. So I just thought I would mention my sort of situation I've had with them. If you agree with me, feel free to like the video, and if you have a sort of different point of view, feel free to leave a comment, and I'd like to read how you guys have dealt with snails. And I have a couple shorts on my channel of how I personally dealt with them if you're interested. Otherwise, I can also do a full video on how I remove snails from my tanks, if that's something that would interest you guys as well. Other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed my point of view on this sort of thing, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye bye everyone.